Hi everybody, I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person at your convention to give you this talk. Sadly my travel schedule has meant that it's been impossible for me to be there today. But I'd like to thank the committee for giving me the opportunity to speak to you in this recorded version, and I hope you find it useful. So let's get on to our talk today. Now before we get on to 5G, I think it would be worthwhile to give you a brief overview of the other forms of technopathic stress. So here's the electromagnetic spectrum. Now the only bit that we are usually aware of here is the thin slice in the middle, the little rainbow around visible light. And this divides the spectrum into two sections, ionizing and non-ionizing. Ionizing means that the particles are energetic enough to knock electrons off an atom, so it can cause genetic damage. Non-ionizing means that this doesn't happen, but it doesn't mean that the radiation has no effect at all. Now, down at the bottom end here, we have radio and television signals, which we're well used to. We've had these for quite some time. Moving up from there, we have mobile phones, cordless phones in the home, Wi-Fi, and smart meters. This is the microwave band, which is becoming very crowded. This is why the 5G represents such a leap forward, because it will move into higher layers of the spectrum. So above that we have the terahertz band, or the sub-millimeter band as it's sometimes called. This is where you find your airport body scanners, for example. Then we get into the range of the spectrum that we are physically able to sense. So we have infrared and ultraviolet around the visible light. Infrared is where you have your television remote controls and things like heat lamps. Ultraviolet is sunbeds and of course the rays from the sun that give us a tan. Then we get into the X-rays, so we have soft X-rays that are used in airport baggage scanners, hard X-rays in medical imaging, and then as the frequency gets higher and the wavelength gets shorter, we get into like gamma rays and cosmic rays, the really damaging high energy stuff. So that's the basic spectrum. This bit here is the area that 5G is interested in. It's the upper end of the microwave band, the sort of sub-terahertz band as it's called. And it's relatively uncrowded just now, which is why they're so keen to use it. So you get much higher bandwidth there, but there's a lot of technological challenges with it that still have yet to be solved. So it's going to be a while before we fully utilize this. So in this talk I'm focusing mainly on these radio frequency, communication frequencies, the stuff that we have in our wireless digital technologies, pulse microwaves that we get in cell phones, Wi-Fi, and of course 5G. So here's a quick primer on the rest of these frequencies. They're pulsed microwaves, and they seem to penetrate the skull more in children than adults, as you can see from this top picture here. So when you're using cell phones and children have the cell phones, they're likely to get much more damage because they're absorbing much more radiation. We find them in Wi-Fi, we find them in our cordless phones in the home. DECT incidentally stands for Digitally Enhanced Cordless Telephone. Now the safety levels at which these are all set are based on thermal effects, which is the point at which water starts to heat up. Like the water in your skin cells starts to heat up, just in the way that your microwave oven heats food. And the limits are set far below these levels based on an average power level. And below this average level, it's claimed by science that there is no biological effect on the body. But the digital signals are pulsed, and the peaks of these pulses can be many times higher than this average level, sometimes 100 times or more greater than the average level. And there's now a huge body of evidence that these biological effects do occur. Other things that we have using this same technology and these same frequencies are smart meters, some of which transmit very, very frequently, and a lot of people have been having problems with this. Games consoles like the Xbox transmits Wi-Fi all the time, even when it's switched off. Did you know that? You have to unplug it to get it to stop. Then we have Bluetooth, and there's an increase in problems with this because there's so many people with this wearable tech, like Bluetooth watches, hands-free devices in the car, Bluetooth headsets and earphones and so on. And that's even before we get to 5G. So 5G is a bit of an exponential leap in this because it's going to require the installation of many hundreds of thousands of small cell transmitters to provide the blanket coverage it requires. But more of that in a minute. This graph is interesting. This shows you the proliferation of pulse microwave energy and how it's increased exponentially in the last 15 years. And this is only covering 3G bands from 900 megahertz up to 2.5 gigahertz. But you can see how the curve has taken off from 2004, 2005, as far as this graph goes, which is 2010. Now, the maximum recommended safe level from the Bio-Initiative Report 2012 is 1000 microwatts per square meter. However, the World Health Organization and the International Commission for Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, or ICNIRP, their recommended maximum levels are about 100 times higher than that, based on these average thermal effects only. And the research for this was done way back in 1998. There's been no accepted independent research later than this that is accepted by these organisations. And because of the government funding cuts and so on, most of the current research that we're seeing is being funded by the phone companies themselves. Obviously, they have a vested interest in this subject. There's very few independent researchers who are promoting stuff like this. Now, the effects of these pulse microwaves are both physiological and psychological. And you see in the picture here the cilia, the hairs of a cell vibrating, and the pulse microwave signals interfere with this. So cell membranes become overstimulated, which prevents their elimination of toxins and nutrient absorption, most of which happens when you're sleeping as your immune system is repairing itself. And one prominent researcher is Dr. Andrew Goldsworthy of the University of London, and he says cell membranes in the body are electrically charged, and the pulse radio waves used by mobiles make them vibrate, dislodging the calcium that binds the cells together. This makes them more permeable and releases enzymes that can damage the DNA in genes, including those that protect us against cancer. This calcium loss results in increased blood-brain barrier permeability, which can result in significant changes in degenerative brain conditions like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's and Lou Gehrig's disease, as well as lesser symptoms which I'm sure many of you will resonate with: headaches, dizziness, tremors, poor memory, sleep disturbances and so on. On a psychological side, the pulse frequencies are very close to our natural brainwave frequencies, and this has a tendency to entrain our brainwaves into unnatural rhythms, causing sleeplessness, depression and other psychological issues. And tests have been conducted with blindfolded subjects that consistently provoked neurological symptoms with the pulse frequencies, but exposing them to continuous wave frequencies did not. And I've certainly noticed I have the trouble sleeping in the presence of a strong Wi-Fi signal. I noticed this when I was away in Dublin, staying for 3 nights in a small hotel, and I didn't sleep a wink. And the bed was really comfortable, it was warm, wasn't cold. I dozed, there was nothing going on with the bed, the street was quiet, there was nothing to show why I should be staying awake. And it was only when I was checking out I noticed that the Wi-Fi router for the building was on the ceiling above the reception desk, which was right under where my bed was. So that's what started me researching this. I thought, there is something to this. And because my main career has been working in theatre electrics, doing lighting and stuff, I've been exposed to these EMFs for most of my working life, and the effects do get cumulative. There's no going back from this stuff. It just gets worse as you go on. So it's the pulsing of these digital signals that seems to be the problem. So the older analog continuous wave signals don't have the same effect. So with an analog signal, you have this continuous wave. There's a small difference between the average and the peak levels. And the average is simply the difference between the peaks and the troughs in the wave. With digital, you have these intermittent pulses with large gaps in between. And because of the short time period of the peaks and the length of the gaps in between, the average, when you factor it out, is much lower than it actually should be. So the peak levels could be 100 times higher than this in some cases. And of course, safety limits are based on the average levels, not the peak. The ultimate analog signal is the cosmic background radiation. This is what they measure when they're pointing microwaves at the sky. And it's the sound of the Big Bang. It's also called white noise. Sounds like this. You used to get this between channels on your TV set in the old analog days, and it's the natural state of the universe, so this is healthy. When I was away from home, and if I had trouble sleeping in a noisy hotel room, I would often turn on the TV between channels and let this noise just permeate the room and blanket every other sound, and after about 5 minutes of this your brain just switches it off and you can get to sleep. You can actually buy white noise generators now, actually, if you're interested to try that route. Now, first generation cell phones were just that, phones. And back in the 80s, I used to have one of the old Motorola bricks. That was my first cell phone. The second generation phones that you see here, the 2G, if you like, were allowing us to send text messages. And we could play Snake, of course. What a fantastic game. And these phones worked on a frequency band of around 800 megahertz and sounded like this. Now, the third generation phones, 3G, allowed us to send picture messages for the first time, and we could access the internet. And then later, when 4G came along, we had enhanced messaging and full streaming internet access, so we can stream music and videos and stuff. Still roughly the same frequency bands. 4G took us up from 800 megahertz up to 2.1 gigahertz. That's kind of where we are just now. This sounds like this. So while we're on the subject of these phones, actually, here's a cautionary tale about carrying your phone in your pocket. The specific absorption rates, or SARs, are much higher and above the manufacturer's safety levels if you carry the phone in close proximity to the body. There's been several cases of men losing fertility because they've been carrying their phones in their trouser pockets, and of women developing breast cancers when they carry the phone in their bra. If you look at the small print in your manufacturer's instruction leaflet, there will be something that says don't carry this phone next to the body. So always try and keep it in an outside coat pocket or in your bag if you can. Moving on to the cordless phones we have in the home. The older ones where you had to pull out an aerial were better, as they were totally analog and they only transmitted when you're on a call. But these newer decked ones transmit a signal at full strength all the time, regardless of whether you're on a call or not. You can get some that are called eco-decked models where there is a setting you can switch it off in between the calls so that it is not transmitting all the time. But these are now widely used everywhere, and you have this signal transmitting all the time in the 2.4 gigahertz band. You get greater exposure from these than you would do if you had a cell phone mast 100 meters away at the foot of your garden. And the levels when you're on the phone with these is similar or greater than that of a mobile phone. Sounds like this. Yeah, quite nasty stuff. So I would say if you're the sort of person that makes a lot of phone calls, or if you have to have a phone in the office to make a lot of phone calls, get a wired landline. Do yourself a favour. Don't use one of these. Okay, Bluetooth. Huge increase in this recently, whether it's headsets, music headphones, loudspeakers, hands-free kits in the car, fitness bands, smartwatches. It too transmits all the time when it's in use, and it's also in the same 2.4 gigahertz band. Now, although the signal is weaker, remember that you're getting two sources of EMFs, as your phone and the Bluetooth device are both transmitting back and forth. Often people keep their phone in the pocket while they're doing this, so you're getting a double whammy. The Class 1 Bluetooth is the weakest, which transmits up to 30 feet, and Class 5, which is quite a new one, is the strongest. That can transmit up to 1,000 feet. Yet this is what they're using in Apple Watches, and they also have Wi-Fi signals and even 4G signals in some cases. So this is all transmitting all the time that this stuff is on. Sounds like this. I used to have a Bluetooth hands-free kit in the car for when I was away on work, and it was one of these ones that clipped onto the sun visor. I had to stop using it because I was just getting a headache because it's so close to the head, you know. So now I just turn my phone into flight mode whenever I'm driving. You know, it's much safer. You're 4 times more likely to have an accident if you're using your phone, whether it's on a hands-free kit or not, if you're using your phone while you're in the car. Wi-Fi. Now, frequencies on Wi-Fi, you get two bands now, 2.4 and 5.8 gigahertz. And the higher one is one of the bands that's going to be used for general 5G use. The higher one can carry more data, but it has less penetrating power through thick walls and so on. So this is why the companies will try and sell you a Wi-Fi extender or a Wi-Fi booster to use in older houses where you're not getting a decent Wi-Fi signal at the other end of the house. And again, the signal is transmitting all the time, and this entrains the brain rhythms. This is what it sounds like. So that's the beat of the drum to which your brain is marching if you choose to live close to Wi-Fi. Can you live without it? Well, yes you can, actually, with a bit of care. Smart meters, I know a lot of people have been having trouble with this. Again, it's the same frequency, and they require a Wi-Fi network in the home to operate. And because there's so many smart meters being fitted and the 2.4 gigahertz band is becoming very crowded, this is why they're keen to get into 5G, because it opens up these higher frequencies where there is more room. Some smart meters transmit almost continuously. Some of the ones that are installing in Britain, I think you can set to transmit only every half hour. I mean, I've refused to have one myself, so I don't know exactly what the situation is with them now. We can still legally do that. You know, we're not being legally obliged to have one fitted, although some companies are putting on a lot of pressure to make sure you do get one, because they've got an obligation to fit them, you know. Whole privacy and security nightmare, because they can be connected and controlled remotely. So, for example, if you have other smart devices in the house like your fridge, then the company might want to turn down the power on that remotely to save power on the grid. They might just want to switch it off for an hour or so without telling you, and they would have the ability to do that. So if your utility company can do that, imagine what hackers can do. You know, so it's a whole security and privacy nightmare. They may also want to charge you higher rates for peak time use, and I know a lot of companies are implementing penalty rates if you don't have one fitted. And if you have multiple blocks of these in an apartment complex, like, you know, if there's one room near the front door where you have like a dozen smart meters and your bedroom happens to be next to that, you get very high power levels near that, which is going to be real problematic for in there. They're also going to need much upgrading over time. Like over 1 million of the ones they've installed in the UK are already having to be replaced because either they've stopped working or people have switched energy supplier and the meter isn't able to cope with the switch, so it just becomes a dumb meter again, although it's still transmitting Wi-Fi and all that. So the real reason the companies are so keen for us to have them is so that they can harvest your data and sell it to other people. They can make lots and lots and lots of money by doing that. It's not about saving you money, you know, because tests have shown that people don't actually save that much money for having a smart meter. It's because the companies can sell your data. It's all about big data. Okay, let's get on to 5G. Now, I've seen a lot of disinformation and conspiracy theories around this, so I hope I can try and give you a better balanced perspective here. Firstly, it's not a thing in itself. You know, it's a whole series of protocols relating to lots of different ways of enhancing the phone spectrum. It is suffering from a tremendous amount of overhype about how fantastic it's all going to be. Of course, we know the reality is somewhat different from that, but it does have some good points and a lot of bad points. So let's dive in. There are 4 key changes with 5G. Firstly, more data much faster. It requires huge increases in bandwidth and speed, although currently it's not hugely faster than the best 4G, the stuff they've been installing. I've seen statistics about 14 to 50% on a good day in the right conditions. So it's not as good as it's supposed to be at the moment. The protocol also calls for lower latency. That's a signal lag between your phone and the mast and so on. This is going to be essential for like driverless cars and other technology that requires this near instantaneous communication, such as virtual reality and things. Beamforming antennae, so-called phased array antenna, simultaneous multiple input and output, or MIMO as it's called. So the beamforming antenna means that the beam will be directed directly to your handset. The multiple input and output means that the mast can cope with, I think the protocol calls for 1 million users per square kilometre. It also has the ability to switch seamlessly between frequencies and use multiple frequencies at once. So we'll see a convergence with all the existing communication frequency bands, including Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. So this graph shows the allocated frequencies for 5G use. At the moment we're under 6 gigahertz, and this is going to be used and continues to be used for general use. The existing 4G frequencies are below 3 gigahertz. So basically we're looking at enhanced 4G, we call it 4.5G if you like. And these higher frequency bands are not in general use yet because they're still working on the technology. You know, there are challenges in getting these higher bands into play. The traditional bands, microwave bands on this picture here, going up to 40 gigahertz are what's proposed for North America. But the higher ones up to 100 gigahertz have been proposed and have been allocated. But actually up to 300 gigahertz is proposed. So the higher frequencies are still experimental at the moment. The UK is talking about using up to 24 gigahertz. and of course it also uses the existing sub-gigahertz bands. So we'd like to see higher exposure levels. And as an example of what else uses these higher frequencies, these airport body scanners use millimeter wave frequencies of around 20 to 38 gigahertz, so-called sub-terahertz band. But this is still in the 5G picture. Although it only penetrates a couple of millimeters into the skin, these scanners are enough to get under the epidermis, and some studies suggest that at high data rates, such as those proposed for 5G, the radiation gets intensified and carried further into the body, which may actually lead to it becoming more intense and damage the DNA. And remember, these airport scanners were introduced without being properly tested. Now we've got the US military active denial system, crowd control system. This uses a frequency of 95 gigahertz, which is towards the upper end of the proposed spectrum for 5G. It's all about the power density, of course. There is a smaller domesticated version of the ADS called Silent Guardian that has a power density level of 30 kilowatts, which is still a fair bit higher than 5G. But of course, it does depend how close you are to the transmitter. And these are all 5G bands. It's a pretty damning picture here. This is showing the effect of RF radiation absorption in honeybees. The top picture shows our existing spectrum. We're mainly using 2 to 3 gigahertz range at the moment, and the wavelength here is relatively large compared to the insect, so it doesn't penetrate very far. But as we get to the bottom picture at 24 gigahertz, the wavelength is closer to the insect's size and penetrates further. So some people think that this is why the insect and bee populations are declining. So these higher millimeter wave bands are needed to provide the high speed, high bandwidth and low latency networks, as we've said, but the tech is still being developed, and it's going to be a few years before that comes into general use. Good bandwidth is also necessary for smart meter networking and for the Internet of Things, the so-called smart grid, where everything in your house, from your fridge down to your toothbrush, is going to be talking to the internet. Whether that's a good idea or not, I'm not sure if anybody has stopped to ask. But for general outdoor phone use, the sub-6 GHz bands will continue to be used, and most coverage will continue to be provided by the existing 4G networks. In a couple of years, the UK is going to be extending up to 24 GHz. North America is already experimenting with bands up to 28 GHz. So these and the higher sub-terahertz bands will be used for mainly localized purposes and experimental testing, like maybe satellite linkages and critical communication links. The small cells and the home routers are going to be required to provide the Internet of Things. So they will be wanting you to put in a home router, or they'll be putting a small cell outside your house in order that you can get 5G coverage inside the house. So this is the general picture of how things are proposed. We'll have a general coverage from low frequency cells. High frequency cells 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz, the 4G bands or the 4.5G bands will provide more dense communications where needed. The millimeter wave cells up to the 26 gigahertz are going to be used for large scale events, vehicle communications, environmental monitoring, smart cities and so on, and improved residential connections and smart energy. So they will be asking you to put 5G routers into your home so that they can beam 5G to that. I've already seen a lot of companies saying you won't need to have a landline anymore because they'll just be able to get 5G straight into your home. In the UK, this is not a cost-effective strategy, and most of the phone companies have said that they're not going to do this. I think it's because we have more stone-built houses than you do in North America. So in North America, where most things are timber-built, you'd have easier penetration for the 5G frequencies. So maybe that's why they're talking about putting so many small-scale routers in. And this small cell deployment is going to need a whole lot of transmitters put in on every odd utility pole and street lamppost and so on, every 100 meters or so. Because the waves are blocked by so many things like trees and walls and even heavy rain. This is the main problem with the 5G, because it requires so many more of these small cell transmitters in order to work. But the irony is that this sort of network requires a fibre optic backbone to get everything working, just to get the bandwidth and the signals to the transmitters. So there's a bit of an ongoing battle between the phone companies who want to give you the 5G and put the small cell transmitters, and the cable companies who want to give you a fibre connection to the home. And I can certainly recommend that we should go for the latter option. I have noticed here in Glasgow they've been putting more fibre in the street actually, so hopefully that's going for that. So yeah, push for fibre. You don't need this 5G stuff in the home. There's major differences in the method of transmission between 4G and 5G that's worth a quick mention. Presently, as you can see in the picture here, this is a typical 4G mast. The aerials are tuned to disperse the maximum power horizontally, and so the main power density happens about maybe 150 to 600 feet away from the mast. So ironically, a mast mounted on the roof of a building might actually be giving less exposure directly beneath the mast than one that's mounted across the road from it. I mean, of course, it's still better than no mast at all, but they do require this blanket coverage. They have this wide beam spreads in order to bounce the signal off walls and other reflective surfaces to get to your phone. 5G, on the other hand, the antennae are much smaller. They can have several hundred small transmitters in each one, and these phased array antennae that can be tuned to produce targeted beams to go to each phone, and they can track them as you move about. And of course the intensity measurements that are being made are focusing on a single beam, and they're not really accounting for real world situations where several beams might be impacting the user with a correspondingly higher power density. And this phased array beamforming does not rely as much on reflections from building, as the beams are directional as long as you have a line of sight to the transmitter. And 5G phones may also be able to relay the signal to another user who's not in direct line of sight. So I say these are very small. Here's a phased array antenna mounted on a circuit board next to a quarter, so you can see how small they are. So your phone handset could have 64 of these little tiny transmitters in the space of a couple square inches. So that's a lot of aerials. So what can we do to protect ourselves? Well, there are some basic steps. First of all, minimize your cell phone use as much as possible. You can do a lot to minimize your exposure by not putting the phone to your ear until you hear it ringing. That will cut down about 90% of your exposure, because when the phone is trying to connect to a mast, it's transmitting at full power. As soon as it makes that connection, it drops down to the lowest power it can. Keep your data roaming and Wi-Fi off except when you need to use it. This will also do wonders for your battery life. Use flight mode as much as you can. Now this has the disadvantage of turning your phone into an expensive answering machine, of course, but it's still worth doing, if you're in a situation where it's not appropriate to be using your phone, such as in an aircraft or when you're driving. I do keep my phone in flight mode whenever I'm driving now. Use a speakerphone when you're on a call, or get an air tube headset. These are very good in that the last few inches of the wire going into your ear are actually physically an air tube. So it's not transmitting the Wi-Fi and the phone signal into your brain. Don't use a cordless phone in the house. Get rid of the deck phones. If you're the sort of person that makes a lot of phone calls, use a wired landline phone. You can still find them. If you really must have cordless, get a low radiation model that has Eco Mod Plus settings, and make sure you set this. That means it will only transmit when you're on a call. There's more of these low radiation models are becoming available, but the best one to get is the Gigaset range. Use home fibre connections, not 5G routers. Push for getting fibre to the home if you can. If your existing router is close to where you use your computer, connect it directly with a standard Ethernet cable. You can even do this with your iPad and phone nowadays with special adapter leads. And you should be able to disable the wireless transmissions on your router, either by a switch or through the control software. Well, in some cases you may have to replace the entire unit to get rid of the Wi-Fi completely. If you can't replace the Wi-Fi router, at least make sure you switch it off at night. And if you need to extend your network, you can use what's called Powerline LAN that sends the internet round through the house using your mains wiring with a special adapter. So you connect an Ethernet cable to that next to your router, and then you have another adapter in the room you want to get the internet, and you plug into that with another Ethernet cable. Or some of them you get with little Wi-Fi transmitters, which you can just switch on and off when you need it. So they're much better to use. It's much more secure, the transmission rates are faster, and they're relatively cheap. And there's several systems available from various manufacturers. Yeah, keep away from Bluetooth, or if you must use it, don't wear it a lot. Don't wear the headset all day long. And you can install shielding materials in your home if you're having problems. You get carbon paints, metallic insulating sheets, metal impregnated cloth, bed canopies, and so on. There are lots of ways you can implement to try and protect yourself from these. The three key words: reduce, remove, and shield. Reduce your exposure, remove things from your immediate vicinity, and shield from them when you can't do that. These are your three basic first line of defence. Now remember the inverse square law. Because radiation propagates in a spherical pattern, the intensity weakens because the surface area of the sphere increases with the square of its radius. So if you were 2 feet from the source of the radiation is 4 times lower than at 1 foot. If you're 3 feet from the source, it's 9 times lower. If you're 4 feet from the source, it's 16 times lower. Remove the radiation source from you as far as you can. Keep things away. The further away you have things, the lower the power is going to be. I live in an apartment block myself, although I have everything wired and I don't have the Wi-Fi on. I can still pick up a Wi-Fi signal from surrounding apartments, but it's relatively low and it's not causing me a problem at the moment. That may change in a few years' time, I don't know. We shall see. So what can we do with dowsing? Well, this is a big area of research and it's wide open for dowsers to get into this. The RF radiation may have an effect on our dowsing ability, although as far as I know there's no research on this. But certainly, if you're in a strong RF signal, I'd be getting a headache, so I wouldn't be wanting to dowse, I wouldn't be able to dowse. So it may actually restrict your responses on that. We can use our dowsing to check for any problems. So we can dowse the danger levels. We could use a simple like a plus-minus chart and see how they affect you personally using the same thing. You could dowse to find a safe distance from the mast or any other source and see how it's affecting you. Is there a safe distance? That's a good question to be asking with your dowsing. You can try harmonising the radiation with a pendulum in the manner of Raymond Grace, using your pendulum to remove any detrimental, non-beneficial frequencies and scrambling them and all that. So, we can certainly try to neutralise this, bring it into resonance with our own frequencies. There's Joey Cohn's blessing process, where he transmutes the frequency to make them beneficial to us. I'm afraid I don't have a lot of faith in my ability to do this, but it's certainly worth a try by all means. Then we have gadgets like shungite, orgonite, and other crystals. So these are certainly worth experimenting with. There is some slight reduction, I think, with these, but a test meter still shows the radiation levels as being very high. So let's see if there's anything we can do with our dowsing. So here's a decked cordless phone, and I'll just try the readings on my acoustic meter. So you can see it's around 5 volts per meter on the peak, and 300 to 400 on the average microwatts per square meter. So let's try see if we can balance this with our pendulums. So here's a simple plus and minus pendulum chart, and if I ask my pendulum to show me the energy reading of the phone at the moment, you can see it's going down to, looks like about -9, I would say. So I can now go over to the phone, and just with my pendulum I'll start it in the reduce minimize motion, and I ask that the detrimental frequencies of this phone, all detrimental energies, be scrambled and neutralized as appropriate in accordance with the highest intelligence of nature, so that only beneficial energies remain for humans and other life forms. And I keep doing this until my pendulum changes direction or stops or does something to indicate that change has taken place. There we go. So now I can start going the other way with my maximizing direction, and here I am affirming that the beneficial energies from the phone are maximized so that all energies are harmonious to humans and other life forms as appropriate in accordance with the highest intelligences of nature. And once again you see my pendulum is now slowing down and stopping, so I can stop sending that affirmation. And let's go back to the pendulum chart, and please show me the energy levels of the phone now. And it's going down to about -7 or -8, so there may have been a slight difference there. Possibly I need to be thinking a bit stronger about that and not trying to record a video. Here's the acoustic meter, let's see what that's saying. and yeah, things are about the same there. There's not been much change. So let me try using some other gadgets, see what we can do. So the numbers to look for here, the one at the top left is the maximum peak level. That's the one that's held at that. The one at the top right is the current peak level in volts per meter. You can see it's hovering around 4 at the moment. And the bottom right shows you the average level in microwatts per meter squared. So I'm just going to try a few widgets on the phone here to see if it affects the readings. So if you keep your eye on the readings on the right, here's a small piece of shungite which is designed to protect your cell phone. And I'll stick this on the back of the aerial here. So there's perhaps a slight reduction there, but nothing really very much to get excited about. This next piece I'm going to try is a new stone called, this is Indigo Gabbro it's called. And again you can see there's maybe a temporary slight reduction, but the peak scale on the left is still well into the red. So take it out. Peaking at about 3.7, 3.8 there. If I put it back in again, still about 3.7, 3.8. So not much difference from that. This last piece is a puck of orgonite. And you see it has appeared to have gone down with this, but I suspect this is largely because the orgonite contains so much metal, so it will actually be interfering with the propagation of the signal. Again, the peak level is still in the red here, so it's not really providing that much of a reduction. Bear in mind that although the dowsing works with subtle energies mostly, these RF radiations are anything but subtle. They're very tangible indeed, and our dowsing influence may be limited in its effectiveness. So although it looks like there might be some slight reduction on the meter, it is very slight, and the radiation levels are still into the high danger zone. And of course you're just repressing the symptoms here without removing the causative factor. So your immune system is still being under stress. It's like you're taking aspirin all the time to mask the pain from a chronic backache. So it may give some short-term relief, but it's not curing the problem. So I think the best we can do is adopt a belt and braces approach. Certainly use your dowsing techniques and any other widgets, anything you can, but your first line of defense always has to be shielding and reducing your exposure from these things. So in conclusion then, I think we do need to be concerned about the increases in pulse microwave communications, and I don't mean just 5G, although the evidence here certainly does suggest that these higher millimeter wave frequencies are more damaging than lower frequencies. We need to ensure that we can take every measure we can to reduce our exposure to this radiation, particularly in the home and particularly in the bedroom, because it's during sleep that your immune system is trying to repair itself. So that's the time you need to be most careful. So if you'd like more information on this and other general EMF hazards, here is my book, which I'm sure you're aware of. This is available directly from my website. It's also available on Amazon, but it's still me that would have to go and post it to you, so why give them their commission? So sadly I'm not here to take any questions, but I hope you found this talk increases your knowledge of the subject. Here's where you can get in touch with me and where you can find me on social media. If you have any comments on the talk, I would love to hear from you, and I hope you found this useful. So thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your convention. Megwitch.